We got a good head start, by the way, in the 2 months leading up to inauguration.
Yeah.
But I'll give you the high level. There's a short story and long story. I can give you the short story for sure. And the short story, both are accurate, but the short story I can give you. The short story is it evolved from a focus on where I was focused, legal, constitutional issues, legislative issues of if you want to save a lot of money, you got to do it through legislation. If you want to look at the Supreme Court landscape for the last few years, it says a lot of these regulations are unconstitutional. That's where I had been focused. And, the way it's gotten started, and you could see this publicly as well, is much more of a technology and digital technology focus.
Okay, so just slow down for a second.
Yeah.
So you were going to use the Constitution to remove legislation.
Well, to remove regulations.
Sorry, regulations.
Yeah.
So you're going to use legislation to remove regulations.
And I've written about this for the last year, right? So
can you give an example of that?
Yeah, I can give a good example of that. So, not to get too academic too quickly, but basically, Congress is supposed to pass the laws, and the executive branch is supposed to enforce the laws. But it turns out that most of the laws that decide what you can and can't do in your life were actually never passed by Congress. They were passed by people who were never elected to their position.
The managerial class.
The managerial class, the bureaucrats in D.C.
What's a law? Give me an example.
Yeah, so they don't call laws, they call them rules, but they have the effect of laws.
Right.
Let's say the amount of fees that fishermen have to pay to the government to have a license to be able to fish in a particular area. Let's say it is the registration requirement before a bank or an asset manager is allowed to do business. Let's say it is the procedural hoop that a biotech company has to jump through before advancing from phase 1 to phase 2 of the development process. Let's say it's the permission that a coal miner or a nuclear energy plant has to get as permission from the government before they build a new nuclear energy plant, which, by the way, has not happened in 20 years in this country because the red tape associated with doing so is so impossible.
Now, I imagine
none of those were passed by Congress.
Yes.
None of those were passed by people that we, the people, elected.
Right.
They were written into law. They call them rules, but effectively into law by unelected bureaucrats.
Right.
And the thing is, that's not a democracy, right? It might be something else, but it's not a democracy. Because in a democracy, if somebody makes a law that affects you, you get to vote them out. That's what it makes a law. These are more like edicts.
Yeah.
Right? Edicts come from a king because you can't vote him out. This doesn't come from a king, but it's a new kind of edict of a bureaucracy.
So just so I can understand,
that was the problem.
You're not against regulation as long as it's decided by democratically elected officials.
That's my most foundational principle. It so happens in my own politics, I'm generally pretty libertarian. I tend to be against. I think most of these regulations tend not to be productive.
But sometimes you need regulation.
But the most important principle is if you're going to have it, at least let the people who it affects to say, if it's not working out for me, I want to be able to vote you out. Now, I need to be able to vote you out. That's the most important principle.
Just so we can understand, like a lot of this probably comes from good intentions.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So these aren't like evil people necessarily.
There's evil. There's certainly malicious people in all kinds of domains of life.
Yes, yes.
And the government is no exception to that.
Right.
And you can see some egregious examples of it. But by and large, I think what we're talking about the regulatory state, the overwhelming majority of federal bureaucrats who I've met are good people because most people are good people.
Yeah.
And they believe what they're doing is not for the detriment of the American people.
It's for the betterment of the American
people. But it's for the betterment of the American people. It's a kind of elite benevolence.
Yes.
And it's sort of skeptical of democracy because the idea that you could just leave it to ordinary people to decide this complicated stuff. We can't leave it to ordinary people because they're going to harm themselves.
They're too dumb.
We have to make that. Exactly. And that was the whole premise of the British monarchy. It's kind of the whole premise of the modern federal bureaucracy.
But I get that. I think it's nice to not paint all these people who are creating this, what do you call it? Creating
bureaucracy, red tape, regulation, exactly.
As nefarious. Because that's not the case.
By and large, most human beings are not nefarious.
And a lot of times it's reactionary. Like I think
most human beings are good people.
Yeah, there was
good intentions.
There was like a fire in New York, I'm pretty sure. And I think one of the rooms was created in like an apartment building. And I think a fireman died because they built the room but didn't ask the city for permission. So the plot or the plan that they had. So then I think what the knee-jerk reaction was to say, you cannot do anything to your apartment without permission for the whole city. I'm probably butchering this.
Yeah, but it's the kind of example you see all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And I get that knee-jerk reaction because you want to protect firemen. These guys are brave. They're running into a fire.
And it's actually a great example because you see that same type of incentive structure show up all the time where someone at the FDA.
Yeah.
They rarely will get hauled in front of some hearing if they fail to approve a drug that saves lives. But if they do approve a drug that has some unintended side effects, then they're going to be in the public eye. So their incentive is to go in one direction, not the other. Does that make them an evil person? No.
Yeah.
Most human beings just respond to the incentives that they have while still in their heart of hearts believing that they're doing good. That's the way the federal bureaucracy
this is your
works,
idea for
but
DOGE,
it's too big. Yeah.
right?
Well, and we laid it out. So there was a Wall Street Journal op-ed that we co-authored soon after it was written, focused on this constitutional approach, where the Supreme Court in the last couple of years came out and said, actually, most of those rules are actually unconstitutional because they didn't go through Congress. That's a big freaking deal. Happened a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So we got that toolkit. And then if you want to really tackle government spending, which is a separate prong, the budget's set in Congress. There's no way around that, right? The budget is set by Congress. If you want to cut trillions of dollars, you got to go to the core of that budgeting process. So that was where my focus and our focus was. I think if you look at, now it's taken off, and I think it could be great. It's very much a digital technology first approach.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, I'll let you read the executive orders that came out last week. And like I said,
we're not doing that.
Yeah.
We got the guy right here.
I know that's it, so I'll be, I'll leave it at what I'm able to say, which is, sort of what you can see publicly. Very technology focused approach, and that there's nobody better to take a technology focused centric approach than Elon. And by the way, we ended up having a pretty open discussion amongst all of us that if my focus is on the legal, constitutional, policy-making functions, that's where my passion has been. The right way for me to realize my own vision is through elected office. And
But
by
not,
the way,
not the governor of Ohio or anything.
all of those except that one position.
Yeah.
Announcement will be coming of some kind in the next couple of weeks.
Got it.
But I will say that even some of the regulations you brought up, right? The fireman example.
Yeah.
Most of those regs aren't just federal regulations. In fact, most of them that affect people at everyday lives are also at the level of the state.
Right.
And, I think short of being a president, when you think about driving executive action to improve people's lives, I think a governor's seat is probably the single best way to actually do it.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
And so that's where I land.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Wouldn't you and Elon coming in as DOGE, isn't that the same as unelected bureaucrats coming in to make a bunch of rules?
So I think it's a super fair question. I've fielded that over the couple of months. The question is, it's one thing if you are undoing the actions of people who have actually affirmatively made rules versus making new rules of your own.
So you're not going to make any rules. You're just taking away rules. I think.
Well, I think if you're rolling back rules and actually cutting bureaucratic overgrowth, it's one thing to come in and say you're going to hire 1 million federal bureaucrats without any authorization from Congress to do it. It's another to say there are 4 million, many of whom were hired without that authorization. We need to scale that headcount back. It's another thing to say all these regulations showed up with Congress never authorizing them. It's another to say they're illicit unless they go through Congress, right? So that was the premise. It's a one-way ratchet. If there's been a federal government overgrowth and a lot of that was never authorized by the democratic process, then it's one thing to say, okay, then all of that, in order to comply with the Constitution, has to be rolled back. You can't make it without authorization.
But how would you apply all of these new tech? You said Elon's trying to do like tech-driven rules.
Yeah, so I'm gonna let.
Wouldn't that be new rules?
Well, so I shared with you my outlook was in what brought me to the project, and I'm super rooting for success and hopeful for success for what's going to come from a technology-driven approach. But that's we had a different philosophy and approach and emphasis.
Talk that shit.
No, it's
talk that shit.
Well,
Me and my wife had different philosophies about
the
dinner
truth of the
last
matter is, I think there's nobody better in the world
Yeah.
to run a technology-focused approach to fixing the federal government than Elon. And if that's where the focus is, I'm rooting for their success. And similarly, when I'm thinking about my legal, constitutional, legislative focus in downsizing government, it's hard to argue the best way to do that isn't through actually being elected in my own right.
I'm sorry. I'm having trouble understanding what the technology-driven approach would be. Can you?
What does that mean?
I mean, all I'll say is at that point,
Can you
I'm
give
not
an
running
example,
that. I'm not running
hypothetically
that.
or whatever?
No, I would say
Because I truly don't know what that means. At
I
all.
hear you. I think we're probably reaching the outer bounds of what I'm able to talk about. But stay tuned. And I'm rooting for success. It's not mine. I mean, I gave you what my outlook is because I could speak for my outlook.
Yeah.
So before you guys started,
I think there's an opportunity. Is there an opportunity to make things more efficient using digital technology? I believe there is.
Yeah.
But that's a different.
But before you guys started it, did you have this conversation about what your outlooks were for this program?
We co-wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed that's
Yeah.
out there that laid out a vision that's pretty consistent.
And then
with
did something
what I've laid out.
change?
Well, I think it's a, first of all.
Did you see him
it's
saluting in the office?
It's and people, I can't believe people lost their minds over that. It was,
No, it looks nothing like a.
What a salute.
People
What
are
a
so,
simple
hey,
gesture,
people are
guys.
so crazy, aren't they? People are so dumb for seeing that and thinking it was
I would
something
never-
else. What
what I
fucking
will say is-
retards we got, right?
Your words, man. Your words. I think that there was a evolution in any new project, right?
Yeah.
This is something like this has never been done. I'll give you one example. Right?
Yeah.
Initially, this was supposed to reside outside of government.
Yeah.
Now it, late in the lead up to starting, ended up in the government. And by the way, here's another thing
That's
that
to
happens.
Alex's point.
When it's in the government,
This is Animal Farm, bro.
when it's in the government, also, I can't run for office at the same time. There's a rule, it's called the Hatch Act, that stops you from independently engaging in your own political activity or running for office while you're in the government. If you're outside the government, it's a different constraint. So there were a lot of things that obviously was supposed to be on the outside for a lot of reasons, ended up moving inside, ended up having a technology first approach. And so when something like this has never been done and you set it up, obviously there's going to be some evolution.
Right.
And it made a lot of sense given the way things, evolved for me to say, you know what, this is the right way for me to achieve my vision and goals for the country and to wish success in taking a technology-driven approach within the federal government. And that's where we landed.
I think that seems like you guys had a, what is it called? Amicable breakup? Is that?
We're super friendly on a personal level.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes a different
It was a
outlook
mutual
in the-
decision, isn't
Yeah,
it?
very much so.
Okay, so you and him aren't beefing, but you just had
Not on
different
a personal
ideas
level.
for the
Yeah,
program.
you got a bunch of people with
I imagine these
different
opinionated
visions
too. Yeah.
of how to achieve similar goals.
Yeah.
You find different ways to achieve those goals.
Did you have a
And so-
combo where you're like, yo, I think we should actually go this direction?
Well, look, I think that it was an evolution of
Yeah.
where we were headed for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, things, in a new project has never been done before. So initially the thought it'd be outside government,
Yeah.
use the legal constitutional basis legislation, ended up, really having an internal to government and technology-centric focus. I think that's great. And I think it could be super successful. And I think there's nobody with that focus. I really mean this. I think there's nobody with that focus that is going to be better positioned to do good things than Elon.
Of course. But
But
initially.
the flip side is also at a certain point, I think this is where it's going to be good for me as well, is if I'm really looking at a unique constitutional vision for the future of the country, grounded in my view of what our lawmaking process ought to be, how do you restore self-governance in America, how do you actually rid ourselves of that managerial bureaucracy that exists at the federal but also at the state level, I think I need to stand on my own feet and be elected to office to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing.